Okay, it looks like everybody's here, so I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Julie, would you have a roll call here?
Yep, Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman.
She's here someplace.
Okay, yep, she waved.
Okay.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Here.
Mr. Gentili,
Here.
Mr. Dance.
Here.
Okay, welcome and thank you for coming again today. First order of business is approval of the agenda. I understand Barry has an addition to the agenda. Barry, you want to tell us about it?
I sent it out to the board on Friday. It is a contract addendum for our runway paving project to incorporate signage requirements that came up in our inspection in December. We're just kind of lumping it into this project to facilitate funding of it through our federal grant dollars.
Do we want to put that down into the airport director's report?
I would put it under new business.
Okay, okay. Do I hear a motion to add Barry's request for,
So move as amended.
okay,
Support.
okay.
Support.
Could we have a roll call on that, please, Julie?
Yep, Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Dance,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman, Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
Okay, so moved. I don't believe we have any public around connected someplace that I've noticed or heard.
We do not.
We do not. Okay, so we'll pass on. We'll pass on down to approval of the minutes. I assume everybody's had a chance to read the April 20th regular meeting minutes, as well as the April 27th special meeting minutes and the May 4th special meeting minutes.
Can I group those together and I'll make the motion?
I don't see a problem in doing that if nobody sees any problem with what has been published and put out in the minutes.
I'll then make a motion to approve the minutes for April 20, April 27, and May 4th meetings.
Do I hear a second on that?
I'll second that.
Okay. Julie, could we have a roll call?
Yes. Ms. Goodman, Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Dance,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili.
Yes.
Okay. Moving on. Next order of business is the April 2020 accounts payable. I assume everybody's gotten a copy of that and has reviewed it. If so, are there any comments, thoughts, additions, subtractions? Looks pretty straightforward to me this time around and pretty simple.
So move to accept the April 20th accounts payable report.
Support.
Support. Julie, could we have a vote on that? Roll call?
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman, Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Dance,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom.
Yes.
Karen, it doesn't show that you're muted, but I also can't hear you when you're speaking.
Nor
So-
can I.
There, how about that?
Okay, just in
Better.
case you wanted to talk, I wanted to make sure you.
No problem.
Okay, sounds good there. Okay, moving on to the 2020, April 2020 financial statement, revenue, expenses, etc. And I assume everybody's he has gotten a copy of that and has a chance to read that and review it. Any comments, concerns, additions, subtractions? The only comment I've got, again, is it's still pretty much in balance with the revenues versus expenses, surprisingly. If there's no changes, comments, etc., do I hear a motion to approve it as presented?
The repairs and maintenance was almost expended. I'm just wondering, in Barry, is there some, it's expended $24,123.35. We're budgeted $25,000, so we're at 96.5%. Is there something that popped up? I mean, we're still within the budget, obviously, but it's about expired.
With still 4 months to go in the year, that is a line item we are going to go over. Susan and I have actually started working on next year's budget, and we're going to increase that. I mean, the recommendation is probably to increase that line going forward next year. I'd have to dig back into details as to what has caused us to kind of go over budget this year. But we did go over budget last year, and I think it's somewhat a reflection of building and equipment is getting older, and we just need to start allocating more dollars on the maintenance item line, which is something we're talking about for next year. So
it's been things that are just kind of popping up that needed attention, had to happen, and we have equipment.
That's, you know, something that's kind of out of the ordinary, but in general, this is a continuation of a pattern over the last couple of years where we're spending more on maintenance each year.
So we need to maybe budget more for that too then, I guess, in the new year?
That is the plan for next year.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, if I recall, and Barry, if I recall, one of those items that might have been a little higher this past year was some repairs for the snowplow vehicle out there, hydraulic system, the drive system.
Yes, I mean,
Or was that the year before? I can't remember.
no, that was, I believe, this winter.
Yeah, that was a pretty good chunk where you had to reach pretty far to try to get that repaired.
Yep.
Right. And the other thing was our fuel tank system that's still hanging in there.
Well, that's still hanging in there. We have not done those repairs yet this fiscal year. So.
But in my mind, those are some of the major, bigger things this past several months.
Yeah, so we need to adjust our funding, and it sounds like we're going to have more expenditures in that area. So yeah, apparently we'll have to do that.
Yes, I agree, Mark. And part of our deal down today is to get set up for a budget committee meeting this coming month so we can look at it next meeting.
I have one other question, I guess, is that on PFC funds, I was looking at that. Do we have available $10,105 at PFC funds?
I guess we're looking, which page of the financial reports? Okay, you're looking at, I can bring it up. That would be this slide. Rotate that. So you are talking about what hopefully you're all seeing on your screen right now.
Right.
Those funds that are in that essentially fund. However, that fund is just part of our general fund. So if you look at our general fund balance this will be the best page to show that.
It's on the trial balance.
So So our general fund balance,
It's the 37,141.
okay, the 37,000.
Mhm.
Of
That-
that 37,000, 10,105 is that PFC funds.
Okay.
And
Is
then
that
another,
I was just wondering, is that typically about what we try to maintain as a budget, or we just had some heavy expenditures, or what? Or is it number of fares too? I don't know.
There's a few things in that. Is that PFC account we have been working down over the last number of years.
Yes.
Probably 6-7 years ago, it was about $100,000. As we've been primarily working on improvements to our T-hangers, first the electrical, then the paving, and then last year the test or trial run on doors. Those funds have come out of that. There is, I guess I'll call it an issue where so far this fiscal year, Public Charters hasn't paid their PFC withholdings. So there's not been any money coming in yet.
Any problem with that, Barry? Do you think we'll be getting those funds or not? It's just a show.
I believe we will be getting those funds, but they will certainly be less than budgeted, because when you're only doing 11 passengers a month like we did in April,
Oh, that hits it hard. Yes.
that's a lot less revenue.
Yes.
So, but October, November, December, January, while they were down compared to previous years, they were nearly that down. So there is some revenue that should come in, but historically, most of our passenger enplanements happen in the summer, and those are certainly going to be depressed to some significant extent, how significant to be determined this coming year. So from what we're anticipating coming in this year, it will certainly be significantly less than budgeted.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Barry.
Correct. Julie, could we have did I get a proposal or a deal to approve the April 2020 financial statement? Could I get
I'll make a motion to approve the April financial statement.
okay. Do I hear a second on that? I will second it then. Julie, could we have a roll call?
Yep. Ms. Goodman,
yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Dents,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to committee reports and discussions. To my knowledge, there was no executive committee that met. Also, no budget committee that met, and no capital projects committee that met during this past 30 days since our previous meeting. One thing down the road here as we go into the meeting, the budget committee, we're going to be talking about that on the bottom there, about setting up a special meeting for that, so we can start discussing the 2021 budget. So,
And
go ahead.
thinking about that, I think it would also make sense for the special projects committee to meet, because if you want to do any capital projects, those would need to be anticipated in the budget. So I think it probably makes sense for that committee to meet first. Then if they have any recommendations for spending priorities for next year, that can then roll into the budget committee, which can then roll into a regular meeting next month, which will still be in time for the county commissioners' budget review, which happens just after our next monthly meeting.
That makes sense. I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. I was kind of thinking that we really don't have much money to grab from for any special projects this year. But anyway, we can talk about it and get things kind of lined up and keep our fingers crossed.
Yep.
So anyway, one of the other things today, we'll try to set up a capital projects committee meeting.
A quick question. With the coronavirus thing, I know there's been some funds that have been available for different entities because of the impact it's having on them. Barry, do you know if we will be receiving any additional federal funds for the airport authority?
It is part of my report, but yes, we are currently slated for $30,000.
Thank you.
Okay, no other comment on that. Barry, why don't we go ahead and move into your portion here? And you've got the floor.
Okay, let me switch over. Ooh. Okay, hopefully everyone is seeing my screen, my report.
Yes, I see it fine.
Okay, so no incidents or accidents in the past month. The item that was just discussed. So we have been awarded $30,000 under the CARES bill, and I've had a little interaction with the state on that. They are working at processing those grants.
Barry,
Yes.
is there limitations on how those funds can be used? Or are they discretionary that we can use for whatever project?
They are intended for operational expenses.
Operational expenses. That's pretty broad enough, I guess.
Yes. They can be used for capital improvement, but the state right now is really recommending not, because if you use them for capital improvement because they're federal dollars, then all sorts of strings become attached to those capital improvement projects, like whatever the Wage Act is that basically requires a certain level of wages, and it becomes a much more complicated project, and for an amount that small, it wouldn't make sense. So the state's recommendation is that we use those dollars for operational expenses, and then if we have saved money because we're not expending dollars in our budget for operational expenses, we could use those dollars locally for any smaller capital projects. I hope
Barry, is there a deadline on it?
I'm not aware of one, but I'm sure it is not completely open-ended. Some of the other dollars under this program need to be spent within 4 years. So if there is a deadline, I'm expecting it's along those timescales, not anything too immediate.
Is
Barry,
there a timeline of when they have to issue you the funds?
No, there is not. But their goal, and the goal of the CARES Act in general, is to get these dollars into the economy as soon as possible. But things generally don't work as fast as Congress would anticipate or would prefer.
Barry, the last time this came up, I think it was a couple meetings back, where we got the $30,000, then the paper showed other airports getting significantly greater amounts than what we had. You had, I thought, checked with the authority there about why did we only get $30,000 when other airports got more? Did that conversation go any further than that, or anything else that came out of it?
I mean, it hasn't really gone anywhere. I did have a conversation with Mr. Dantz in between meetings, and he was going to bring it to the attention of certain of our representatives and senators.
I recall that conversation, mention of it.
I mean, the way for us, the dollars were allocated, it is per what the Congress's intent was. Basically, we just kind of fell in between certain things. So, you know, there weren't enough of us small essential air service airports that we really got any attention in how that language was originally written. So to kind of, you know, repeat is for airports that did not have at least 8,000 enplaned passengers, basically they were treated as general aviation airports and fell into those rules, which allotted to the $30,000. If you had 8,000 to 10,000, you would have had a minimum of 600,000, and 10,000 and above, a minimum of $1 million. And then there were some issues or formula oddities that certain airports in kind of that range ended up with a minimum of 15 million, which was kind of many
Wow.
their actual operating expenses. The word out of DOT is they're not going to pull back those dollars, even though one could argue it was a mistake in how they were awarded, just because those dollars got published very broadly in the press and other channels. They have instead said that they're going to enforce this 4-year time span that they need to be expended by. So that will result in some of those dollars not getting expended, just because for many of those airports, there's just not need for that much money in that time period. There
Sounds
is
conceivable.
there's always talk in Washington about subsequent funding opportunities or bills. There is a little bit of talk of trying to address some of these issues going forward. But at this time, I'm not hearing much that's really active in that. Nothing was, for example, in the House's bill that got passed last Friday as it relates to any of this and airports.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on that? From my personal perspective, following that kind of guidance for 8 to 10 of 600, 10,000 or more, $1 million, if you would kind of follow how funding works for airports, we probably should have gotten 150,000 as a small EAS commercial service airport. But again, we just kind of fell in the cracks of how the wording was worded.
Barry, do you think there's an opportunity down the road then if they're not going to be able to use all that money? Is that a possibility or not? Don't know.
Because again, the wording is such that we got what was appropriate given the wording or the language of that statute.
Okay. Even if some other airports send $1 million back, I guess.
It
Huh?
needs to go back into general allocation and then be divided up on a priority basis across all airports in the country on an equal basis. So
Okay. So we might get some funds then again, possibly. Huh?
we could, but we're then competing in a very different pool with every airport as opposed to, you know, specifically looking at something allocated towards our type of airport.
Little more difficult competition, I guess. Huh?
Yep.
Sure sounds like it.
Then the last thing here is just something I want to bring to your attention. I'm not too concerned, but I think it's worth mentioning to the board so you're aware. Because this came up, I don't know how long ago it was. I know it was before our last monthly meeting, so I think it was between March and April's meeting. There was a conference call DOT to all essential air service airports. And one of the things mentioned on that call was concern that DOT has as it relates to this item. And I'll step back to explain a little bit things. So as it relates to essential air service, there are certain eligibility criteria that Congress has established that basically can exclude airports from being eligible for essential air service. We generally, because of our distance from Chicago and Detroit, don't fall into most of those eligibility criteria. For example, if you are within 210 miles of a large hub, you are capped at $200 per passenger in subsidy. We are outside that. If you are within 210 miles, you must have a minimum of 10 passengers per day. We're outside that, so it doesn't apply. However, there is one overriding eligibility criteria, that is, any airport cannot exceed a subsidy of $1,000 per passenger, which currently for us means our existing contract is $3 million a year. The new one likely to be approved is 3.6. We're talking a calendar year that switches in kind of the tail end of the calendar year. So I'll round it off to 3,500. So we need a minimum of 3,500 passengers to fall underneath that $1,000 passenger subsidy, which normally is not an issue. We've been 10, 11,000, although last year we were down from that. However, when you do 11 passengers a month like we did in April, and likely looking at 30 in May, and even if that does, return to more normal levels, we're significantly behind even a 3,500 as of this point in the year. The criteria that DOT has, all of those other ones that don't apply to us, DOT can waive. However, the 1,000 passenger is not waivable, and it's an immediate termination from the Essential Air Service Program. If Congress doesn't act between now and next year on that topic, there are likely to be, I'd say, half of the Essential Air Service airports that would get kicked out of the program because of that and the coronavirus complete meltdown in demand.
Wow, that's pretty significant.
So,
Oh, yeah.
something to be aware of. It is going to take an act of Congress to address. There's plenty of time for that to happen. However, it just should be on people's mind that if you don't hear me giving you updates, later this summer, that you should ask.
Mhm.
I should be reminded to give you updates.
So it pretty much shuts down airports of our size in the whole good old US of A, it sounds like to
And
me.
once you are deemed ineligible, that is a permanent distinction. So you're kicked out and never allowed back in.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So
Wow. Well, there's a lot of distance between now and then, and a lot of things can happen. So we're just gonna have to listen and follow through with it.
yep, I just wanted you to be aware of that current situation since it was brought to our attention by DOT themselves.
Okay,
Maybe we'll run a few $10 tickets.
there you go.
Okay, airfares. It's crazy out there right now. And this report kind of gives you a hint of that. So I'll just kind of talk about just the averages across, and as I'm highlighting things here, do you see that?
Yes,
Right, yes,
in blue.
I did.
yes.
So that top line that's highlighted, average fare. So our average fare between last month's report and this month's report changed minimally, up $15 to $300 average. Grand Rapids was about the same, up $15. Traverse City, though, average fare increased $454. Muskegon's average fare increased $340. Traverse City right now is over twice as expensive as us on average, as is Muskegon. I mean, if you look at the details, for example, the lowest fare between Traverse City and Denver right now is almost $1,500. Whereas out of Grand Rapids, that same fare right now, because they have Frontier service, is $176. I mean, it's crazy out there. Part of this is that the airlines' major cuts to service kind of happened after our last meeting, as they were starting to work through the ramifications of this. So, for example, Traverse City, which normally would have at this time of year, going into summer, even in June, because these are June fares, would have probably 10 to 15 flights a day. Right now, they have 3 or 4 on the smallest airplanes that the carriers operate. There's 1 flight a day out of Traverse City on Delta, 1 flight a day on American, and currently still 2 on United. So, I mean, and just those changes and how they then ripple through the system are causing kind of this upheaval in fares.
Do the feds get into this, Barry? In other words, they got this spacing of 6 foot and stuff. Do they do that with airplanes too, or not?
Currently, no. And I mean, and realistically, aviation is built around the concept of getting as many people as possible into a small confined space.
Mm-hmm.
Social distancing and airline revenue are completely polar opposites. You're starting to see some of this in the media where airlines are saying, well, we won't fill middle seats unless necessary. And, as they've scaled back their schedules so much and using smaller airplanes, even though right now we're seeing about 9% the amount of traffic as a year ago at this time, some of those planes are actually getting fuller because you used to fly 4 flights a day with a 150-seat aircraft, and now you're flying 1 with 50 seats. Even at 10%, that 50 seats is getting fuller. So you're starting to see, media reports of flights that are full, and so, I mean, United got caught with this last week, so they're reacting on allowing people on full flights to, rebook at no fee, but they're not limiting sales to, a percentage of an airplane that basically makes it unprofitable.
Barry, what you're talking about, I think that was somewhat covered on the news yesterday, Sunday evening. There was a few highlights of that talking about just what you talked about.
Yep.
Right.
So, you can't throw a lot of input or weight into these fare numbers just because the whole industry is in turmoil. But I do want to point out that I did add something this month, and I will for the next couple months as we look forward to transitioning to fare service. And that is that last column, which is labeled UIN. That is the airport code for Quincy, Illinois. Quincy is a Cape Air city that it is their other Cape Air city that flies into O'Hare. So I basically ran through what all of the flights currently cost out of Quincy as an American code shared flight. So the pricing is determined by American, flying through Chicago. And you'll see that it's a little bit lower than our average fare with Southwest, but kind of within, I would say, the realm of noise in the data. But still very competitive historically. I mean, it's like $50, roughly $50 more than the average flat out Grand Rapids, which that's, you know, it seems very reasonable. So if that is representative of what American and Cape Air will do in our market, I think that bodes well for us. And since it's easy for me to pull these numbers, if after, you know, service starts with American and we find that we're significantly higher than Quincy, this gives me ammunition to go back to Cape Air and for them to go back to American and basically say, you know, it's kind of the same distance, it's the same cost structure. Why are these fares that different? I was encouraged by that, although I'm not going to give it too much weight, just in light of everything else that's being shown here.
Gary, if I recall, didn't they also co-share with United?
They interline with United.
Oh, okay.
They don't code share with United. And I wasn't seeing any interline fares with United
Okay.
in the booking site that I normally look at, which is Kayak. And that's, again, some of those things that we'll have to look at and monitor is not all fares show up equally in all locations, and finding where good fares show up and, you know, then training everybody to know where to look for the best fares. Because the industry is very fragmented as it comes to where you can find certain fares. Any other questions on the airfare report?
No.
Okay, I've already kind of talked to this one. Demand, I mean, travel demand is virtually non-existent. Starting to slowly crawl back. I can, you know, we're impacted differently and to a slightly greater extent than the industry as a whole. But in some of the data that I look at coming out of TSA, the airline industry hit its low point mid-April. I think it's Tuesday, April 14th was a total number of 87,000 passengers across the entire country that day, which was 4% of a year ago number. We're now about 2.5 times more than that. So yesterday's number was around 250,000, which is about 9% of a year ago. So after that bottoming in mid-April, it's been kind of coming up, I'd say 20% a week off of that bottom. So we're now about, you know, 2 to 2.5 times where we were at that bottom, but we're still eons away from normality. And, you know, no one's predicting that we're going to get there anytime soon. In fact, many of the predictions are that the industry won't recover fully for 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
No one can predict the future, so, you know, take every future prediction with a grain of salt, but it is going to take time. And again, part of that is just people's comfort level with a industry whose need is to cram as many people into a small space as possible. As I was talking about that 3,500 passengers for the year to fall under that 1,000, you can see where we are through.
Barry, can you shift the screen over a little bit so we can see that last column?
You're seeing.
I don't see the total of the 2020 column, that column. A little bit more. Yeah, the way you're going, if you can.
I can't move any farther.
Okay. There you got a little bit there.
Let me instead.
I can see all of it. I don't know if he needs to make an adjustment on his screen.
Oh, I don't know.
So we're currently at 425 for the year, you know, without the DOT being able to waive that because of the current circumstances. We've got roughly 3,000 to go for us
Right.
all outside that, which on a normal year would be, no big deal at all, and may not be a big deal this year even, but we don't know. No canceled flights. I mean, from an airline perspective, things are running perfectly.
We had a great cancel delay month, 0, perfect numbers.
Now, it's impossible for me to actually figure out what a delay would be, because when the airline has no passengers, they just arbitrarily choose when they're going to leave, because they're trying to keep their cash flow at a minimum. So instead of departing here at 8:30 in the morning and coming back at 7 o'clock at night and spending the whole day in Chicago, they're avoiding all of those costs in Chicago, which are significant, by not spending time down there. So take the delay with a complete grain of salt, because it's completely arbitrary, but they have flown every day, so the cancellation is accurate.
Well, as long as they're doing that to minimize their costs and things like that, and still picking up every passenger that's out there waiting to go, that's good.
Any other questions on this? Okay, moving on then. So summer schedule is open, and it has been for a while, and that's through Public Charters, the end of their current contract. I talked with Jim Gallagher last week, and their plans right now are to fly the Dornier every day of the summer, so 7 days a week with the jet, and 2 flights a day on our traditional peak days of Thursday, Friday, Sunday, and Monday, with that second flight being with the Beech 1900, which still is not online, and I will talk about that in a second. So even though we may not see demand on, let's say, a Tuesday for 30 seats in the summer this year, or especially early in the summer, or even 2 flights on a Thursday, they're planning on flying that because the subsidy dollars are there to allow them to do that. And that's the only way they're going to make revenue this year, is by flying nearly empty flights, because they get $0 of revenue if they're not flying anything. So
Kind of like they're doing right now.
sort of what they're doing right now, but with additional flights.
Right. Good.
Realistically, we'll have the best summer schedule we've had in a couple of years this summer. Unfortunately, probably without many people taking advantage of it. Some switching gears to a couple other topics. So our PFAS, I've been kind of giving the board updates on this. Since our last meeting, some details have emerged on this environmental study that the state legislature has allocated in this year's budget $4 million to basically fund through grants. The RFP for those grant proposals is currently open through the end of this month. We are eligible for up to $250,000 to do this environmental study. I've been working with both Eagle, MDOT, and Prina Newhoff on what this may look like. Prina Newhoff will be our essentially consultant for this project, and will be doing this work. and they are putting together the grant proposal. It's a completely, from my perspective, nonsensical program the way they're doing this, but they need to get these grants awarded before the end of the fiscal year. So this entire window to put together and submit grant proposals is less than 30 days. For a $250,000 project, we should be approaching multiple consultants trying to get the best value for our dollars, but you can't solicit multiple proposals and get that all put together and submitted to the state in 30 days. So we're just going down the path, as most airports are, of using their existing consultant relationship to put together proposals to do this work under this grant.
Do they have the kind of time to do that too?
Yes. And because they, for example, Pre-Newhoff, they represent, of the commercial air service airports in the state, 5 or 6. They're basically, a lot of it becomes boilerplate at that point. And then, other things get tailored to the specific needs of the airport. So they can turn this around fairly quickly.
Okay, so they'll have it done before end of May then, I guess, huh?
These are real dollars. They're not, they're real size projects.
Well, Barry, I would continue doing what's going on with Pre-Newhoff. That's the only game in town at the moment
I
here.
wanted to make you aware if, you had questions on, well, why are we kind of doing this without going out for bids? The state has not given us time to do that.
Right.
Barry, what this environmental study, it's the nature of this. Are you looking for pollution? Are you looking for animals? Or what are you going to use this for, I guess?
We're under the category of PFAS. So that's this emerging chemical that airports are kind of in the crosshairs of, because it's a component of the type of firefighting foam that airports use. And in the state, some of the contamination hotspots are former military bases who use a lot of this chemical for training and other purposes. So the state is trying to get ahead of the curve on this. Michigan is probably actually one of the leading states on kind of addressing this issue. And the state has now allocated funding last year at the rate of $400,000, which we used to purchase some testing equipment. This year at $4 million to study the impact. And the way I look at it is, okay, it costs $400,000 to prevent the problem going forward, $4 million to study what the problem is.
Wow.
I'm thinking it's, $40 million or more to actually remediate the problems that are found. The state's been gracious to cover the financing of those first two. Everyone is asking, well, is the state going to pony up if we do find issues? And everyone knows you're going to find issues because we've dispersed this foam into the environment, into the soils, and therefore, yes, it exists there. When you look for it, you are going to find it. Everyone knows that. Who's going to pay for expected cleanup? And the state is very quiet on that front. But we kind of have to do these other things as well and then fight those funding battles when we get to those points.
Do you think we will get stuck with having to pay a portion of this or not?
I honestly think it depends on how much that total bill ends up being.
Okay.
I'm hopeful that the fact that we sprayed foam once per year solely for the purpose of testing the equipment into one area means that we don't have a huge mitigation problem. Although because our soils are sandy, over 13, 14 years that we've been doing this, how far that contaminant has migrated into the soil. That's why these studies are being done.
Mark, the big problem on this is it's getting into the water tables and contaminating the water systems.
And for us,
Water.
we have a city water well
Right.
smack dab in the middle of airport property. So that's going to be an interesting, and I've already given city DPW a heads up that this study is going to be being done this year, and that they, may get pulled into this at some point because they're operating a public municipality water well within some distance of a known source of contamination.
So we don't know any idea how big a problem this might be, I guess, or do we
This year's study is all about, is really to
find out? Yeah.
soil borings and to understand what the potential risks are and what potentially cleanups might be.
Yeah,
Have they come up with a financial parameter on this? Is it like a 10% match local, or has none of that's been determined yet? What, I don't know.
This should be, as long as it falls within the $250,000, a 100% state-funded grant.
Oh, good.
Hey, Barry, the testing, was that state mandated or federally mandated? The annual foam test.
That is federally mandated. That is an FAA requirement for airports that basically have fire equipment.
So then you would probably, I guess my sense would be that the state's probably going to push any liability off to who mandated the testing be done.
I'm sure everyone will, once it's known how expensive this is, I'm sure everyone will try to force someone with deeper pockets to pay for it. Yes.
Barry, do you know if this is going to be a zero tolerance issue, or is there going to be some level of contamination that's passable?
There technically aren't even federal contamination level guidelines yet. Technically, the EPA at the federal level, this is still not considered a hazardous chemical, although it is at the state level. And there's a lot of things that are evolving in this area. And quite frankly, many things are behind the curve on it. The state, for good or bad, is trying to be ahead of things. So, that's why they've allocated these grants the last 2 years to really get a better understanding as to where things are.
and my guess, just thinking about all this stuff, there's not going to be any good idea for remediation of this problem. My guess, it'll fall back to watch and monitor down the road.
Well, that would be good.
It's
Yes.
kind of like, I think it falls in, you guys have probably heard about the super funds over the years when that started about 35, 40 years ago.
Yep.
Most of the super funds came out to just isolate and monitor and let nature kind of take care of itself over the next 30 to 40 to 100 years. That's my guess feeling. Go ahead, Barry.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Fuel system monitor, I do not still have an update on that. I likely will get bids on that this month. Gate repairs, some of you board members are aware that the gate we have here, actually 2 of our gates, neither of them is working properly and hasn't been for probably 6 months. Our electrician, quite frankly, has been dragging his feet on getting that done. And he was here this weekend, and my understanding, although I haven't talked to him directly, is he got the repairs done, but ran into an issue reprogramming the card readers for the gate cards. So we're still not operational. And I'm certainly going to hope that it doesn't take them another 4 months to get that last piece done. But that's an update as to where things stand. So there will be a bill coming our way for these repairs. And I know the parts are in the order of $1,000. I don't know how much labor will be.
Okay, I was just gonna ask that question.
Moving on. So our airport emergency exercise, some of this is information I've already given you, was originally scheduled for the end of this month. We got a delay or a postponement until September by request of the county emergency manager. With our choice of air carrier now being Cape Air and them operating 9-seat aircraft, this no longer becomes a requirement for us. We no longer need to do a full-scale emergency exercise every 3 years. So I'm anticipating that once we get back to more normality, that I'll have a conversation with the new county emergency manager and just see whether or not they want to continue with plans for this or cancel it since it's no longer required. I suspect we'll end up canceling, but it's really more their call because in the past, we've actually done more than one of these every 3 years because the participants felt that they did so poorly that they needed more practice than practicing it once every 3 years to focus on specific issues that arose in these exercises. So, there may still be a desire to do something like this, but I suspect given everything else that's going on in the world, probably not this year. So
What was the outlay on this before for us? What's our part of this?
there really is no expense other than providing donuts and coffee.
Okay, great.
Gary,
Thank you.
a question. If we don't have to do this because of Cape Air and the 9-passenger plane, and if we don't go ahead and do this, sometime down the road, if we get a larger plane back in, is there going to be any problems to picking this back up as if it was continuously being done?
So going into a little more detail. So what enables us not to do this is we have been categorized as a Category 1 airport. And for a Category 1 airport, this is a requirement. With only 9-seat aircraft, we are being recategorized as a Category 4 airport. And pretty much the only difference is this item. If we did get in the future larger aircraft, we would have to go back to being a Category 1. And we would then be given about 12 months time to fulfill this requirement.
Okay.
This is the situation we found ourselves in when we had Frontier, is that was the first time this became a requirement for us. So we actually ended up getting a delay. So we had a little over a year where we got it completed at that time. So yes, we would need to do it. We would have ample time to plan and to do it.
Okay.
What was the expenditure on that in the past then? Was it much at all?
What was that?
What was the expenditure for that in the past? Was it much? I don't think so.
There is generally no expenditure.
No expenditure. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. A related item is our annual firefighter training, which we did hold here on May 9th, Saturday, I guess a week ago. And normally, we generally only do that training on site every 3 years. So we kind of align this training with our exercise. This year was the year where that should have happened, but because of the postponement and the exercise, they ended up not happening together. Normally, other years, so 2 out of every 3, We just send our firefighters to a neighboring airport, usually Saginaw, to basically participate in their recurrent training that happens there. So normally this line item costs us $2,000 a year for the training and travel. When we do it on site, it costs about $6,500. This was the $6,500 year, and unfortunately, when we do hold it on site, we normally get a good turnout from supporting agencies, City of Manistee, Manistee Township, East Lake has participated. This year, even though we extended the invitation to all of those agencies under the current environment, basically no one showed up. We had one person from Manistee Township, the assistant fire chief there, show up. So we ended up spending a lot more money and training a lot fewer people than we could have if we weren't in the middle of the environment we're in. So
Right.
we're done, and it's just unfortunate that more people couldn't take advantage of the fact that we had a mobile trainer here, live fire training, and we didn't even get the newspaper out here this year to kind of take pictures of, flames shooting up, which we normally have.
Well, I hate to say it, I had it marked on my calendar to come out and watch and observe, but I completely overlooked it.
It's quite all right. There wasn't really a lot to see this year.
Okay.
Yeah, I passed the fake airplane on my way out there. They were already leaving, so I missed it.
Okay.
This is kind of bringing up an old business item from this past winter. So Ted Aaron's hangar, we haven't talked about this in a couple months. I guess we did 2 months ago talk a little bit about it, and we were gonna wait until our airline selection process had concluded, which it now, well, not completely concluded, but we know where that's heading. Ted has reached out to me over the spring and basically indicated that he's still interested in following up with the authority under the terms that we were being discussed back in December, which is essentially he would donate the hangar to the airport. He would get basically a tax deduction for that donation. We would take on any responsibility for any door repairs. If you recall that there are some issues with water infiltration that potentially are hindering the integrity of the door. And in exchange, he would request that if space is available in our T hangars, that he could basically utilize one of those rent-free to store the stuff he's currently storing in his hangar. That's where things were left in December. Once it became clear that Public Charters was not going to need it this winter, things kind of stalled there. So Ted is still interested in pursuing this. Over the last month, it's come to my attention that there is an aircraft maintenance business in Cadillac that is expressing interest in utilizing that hangar to move a part of their business to our airport. And I've had conversations now with Cape Air, and they've also indicated that they would strongly like to have hangar space to accommodate their aircraft. And that is the only hangar on the airport that could accommodate their aircraft. Well, I shouldn't say it's the only one, but the other one would be the hangar that we've just basically transferred ownership to Mr. Shively, and he's housing his aircraft and working on improvements to that building over time. So we now have an opportunity with potentially 2 different tenants that are possibly looking at that. Ideally, I would love to find a way to allow them both to use it, because the benefits of having a business and an aviation-based business here on the airfield are huge as far as attracting traffic and airplanes and all sorts of things that would be really good for us in the long term. But also having the airline have a hangar so that they can be as reliable as possible also is a huge thing. So I'd love for figure out a way of accommodating both of them. I have no idea if that's possible. But at this point, I would recommend that we proceed with kind of finalizing the transaction with Mr. Ahrens, because now I'm confident that with two interested parties that we'll have enough revenue to offset any costs and or lost revenue from kind of the status quo.
Barry, is this possibly a competition situation where somebody would be willing to pay more than the other one or something like that?
Anything is possible. I have not really entertained discussions with either party as to what they'd be willing to pay. And again, there is benefit in meeting both of their needs. We only have one hangar, so I don't know if that's possible. So I don't necessarily at this point want it to be a, highest bidder gets it. I ultimately think that we need to think strategically and make sure that we're not only looking at a revenue stream, but we're looking at the total impact to the airport. And look at what is best for the long-term interests of the airport.
Okay, so in a sense, you've got two entities that are very serious about purchasing the hangar. Is that correct, or just
Say at this point,
renting it?
leasing, yes.
Okay.
Did you in the past have a cost on fixing up that door? I think I heard one time.
No, there really hasn't been. And that's something that, well, the entity that basically discovered the issue was a firm that installs doors by this manufacturer. And the manufacturer basically said they wouldn't authorize any form of repair. They would only certify a new door. Obviously, it's in their best interest to do that, get a door sale, which basically, that's a pretty big ticket item. I believe that there are repairs that are possible, but we're essentially going down a path where we would need the appropriate engineer / person who could basically, sign off that the repairs that are planned would make the door safe for, the foreseeable future. I've not pursued doing that. Cape Air indicated that they probably would be willing to send someone out to do that or work with us on that. So I think there are options that we have. But so the short answer is no, we don't have a number. I don't think it's a huge number. And by huge, I'm thinking more than $10,000. I think it's 10 or less. But I don't have anything to back that up right now.
Would we be looking at selling it, or would we be looking at leasing it?
Leasing it would, I think, would be our goal, because that retains our ability to basically utilize that asset in the best ways for the airport, as opposed to selling it. Then, we no longer have the ability to utilize that asset in ways that may be most beneficial.
Now, the lease you're talking about would be either to the aircraft maintenance business in Cadillac and or Cape Air. That would be a lease either way.
Unless something else comes up, but those are the two
Right.
I've talked to recently. I would say the Cadillac one would probably be a little bit longer term.
Right.
Cape Air, probably they couldn't commit to a lease of more than the length of their contract.
Yes. Okay.
What kind of income do you anticipate it would produce?
Unknown. And again, it's, I'd say a minimum of 5,000 a year, a maximum of maybe 15.
Okay, I just want some idea how long it'd take to pay for the door.
It
Well,
depends
that's
on the
something
cost of the
covered
door.
there.
It depends on the cost of the repair of the door as to how long the recovery takes.
But I mean,
Yeah, I
I,
know it.
if that is the question, I would say I believe that in a maximum of 4 years, we could recoup that cost.
Barry, I'm thinking that this might be a nice topic to kick around in a smaller group such as the Capital Committee.
And since we're talking about scheduling a meeting of that committee, I think that would be a good idea. Yes.
Okay, we wanted to have the Capital Committee look at items for this next year's budget. And now we've got a second thing for them to kick around and discuss and so on. So, Andrew, I'm actually the chair of the Capital Committee. So I think what I'll do is ask everybody if they're open to that, then I'll go ahead and put it on the internet, a potential time for a meeting, for the Capital meeting, and go from there. And I'm thinking because this room where I'm sitting right now is big enough easily for the three of us to be correctly distanced and everything else, we could have it right here at the airport conference meeting room. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
And the 3 people on that committee are.
Andrew, Phil, and myself.
Yep.
Jerry, that sounds fine with me. I'm out of town this Thursday, Friday.
Okay.
I'll be back into town Sunday.
Okay, I'll put a couple dates out there and we'll go from there. We can fish around and get some dates that are, a date that's agreeable to all of us. So I'll go ahead and ramrod that and get a date for us to set up in the meeting here, then talk to Julie to get a little notice out for a special meeting on the Capital Committee.
Okay. Moving on, this slide doesn't have any updates, so I will continue moving on. Our big $1 million airport runway project is upon us. We will be closed for this work as an airport from noon on May 26th through noon June 5th. And let's hope that we have many bright sunny days in that period so that the work can get done. The airline's already canceled all the flights for that window. The starting at noon and ending at noon is so that we can actually have flights scheduled on the 26th and the 5th. So that that Tuesday, May 26th, the flight goes down at 8:30 in the morning, comes back at, I think, 11:20, just before noon. And then on June, there's a flight scheduled in the afternoon. So kind of trying to minimize airline impact. There was a pre-construction meeting with the consultant, contractor, state of Michigan, FAA. I'm sure I'm missing a couple. There were like 12, 15 people on that call last week. Everything seems to be a go. Site work will begin late this week. They're currently planning Thursday and Friday to do some site work to prep them being ready to start after the holiday weekend. So all of that is right now a go. So good to get that completed after all of the turmoil that we've seen on that over the last year. And
so apparently there's no problem with Reith Riley and so on coming in. They're off strike, et cetera, and so on.
Yep. Nope. Everything's looking good there.
Is that to go? Okay, good.
Wildlife survey, still working to close that project. The FAA independent fee estimate that the board approved doing 2 months ago. That work's been mostly done. Now we're dealing with a discrepancy between the estimate and what the consultant's plans are. So there's another iteration of that process that needs to happen over the next week or so. But we're toward the end of that. Air service. So looking at current service, a lot of this is duplicated things I've mentioned already, but we're currently getting daily flights with the Dornier as necessary. They are flying, but not necessarily having passengers. We're currently averaging about 5 passengers per week. I just updated our board here, and after tomorrow, we actually have at least some passengers each day for the next week. So that's an improvement of where we've been the last 6 weeks or so. The Beach 1900 is still sitting, waiting for the FAA to resume in-person activities. Talking with Jim Gallagher, he's leaving by the end of this month, but it's out of pretty much everyone's hands right now. EAS selection process. So at our last meeting, your decision to go with Cape Air, I've submitted the airport authority's official recommendation to DOT. Within this window of community comment, that window ends today. So people can still submit comment by the end of the day today. I have solicited letters of support from both the Chamber of Commerce and / Economic Development Group. I'm not sure if they want to do 2 letters, a letter from both of them, leaving it for them to decide how they want, and as well as the CVB, who's already submitted their letter last week. Typically, the process from here is that DOT will issue a decision and award a contract. That process typically takes 2+ months. And, you could say the clock starts counting today once the comment period closes. I've seen it as fast as 6 weeks, and I've seen it also take 4 months. So since we're now after the middle of May, if you take 2 months, we're talking end of July would be the time frame I would expect them to award this, for service to start October 1st. So that basically gives about 2 months lead time to kind of work through all the transition items. I've started initial conversations with Cape Air on transition. Generally, they don't commit resources, other than talking on the phone and, kind of doing some soft items until DOT officially awards. It's not their contract until they have a contract, even though one would anticipate everything, kind of going down our recommendation process. There's no guarantee that that will be the case. Thus, you're not going to commit to a lot of things that are going to cost a lot of dollars until they have that contract in place. From my perspective, the item that will be most important and has the longest lead time is really a schedule. So again, if DOT operates normally, they would be, awarding something mid to late July. That's 60 days before start of service. Generally, 60 days before is when people are planning, trips often. So we want that schedule to be published as soon as DOT awards that contract. So that is obviously work that needs to be planned and figured out beforehand. There is a little bit of, variability there, because one of the areas that DOT might follow our recommendation or might not is in the thing I asked the board's support on at the end of our last special meeting, and that is to provide Cape Air with flexibility on how they schedule their flights during the course of the year, as opposed to what they have specifically in their proposal, which is the 6 months of 2 flights a day and 6 months of 4 flights a day. And where that comes into play specifically right now is October is the last month of their 4 flight a day schedule as it is in their contract. I don't anticipate that we will need 4 flights a day in October, then dropping to 2 flights a day in November. But without knowing what DOT will award and what flexibility they have, we may have to work with Cape Air and kind of having here's the 4 flight a day schedule if that's what DOT goes with, or here is a more flexible schedule if DOT follows through on what we've requested. And that carries then through, because I would like to see more than 2 flights a day over Christmas, more than 2 flights a day over Thanksgiving. So not knowing where DOT will ultimately rule, we'll probably need to kind of work on 2 parallel schedules so that as soon as it's awarded and we know the details, we'll be able to publish one or the other. So those are kind of how I see the summer developing. It was discussed at our last special meeting whether or not Cape Air, whether it would be possible for them to start sooner. I've reached out to them. They indicated that they have aircraft availability, so they don't have equipment bottlenecks that would prevent them from starting sooner. The schedule as it is kind of a typical schedule for DOT to transition through a process. We couldn't expedite this potentially, but at best, DOT is still going to take a month, so that'll put us to the end of June. Then getting a schedule published and starting to sell, probably the best we could do if everything aligned would be a Cape Air start date of August 1st, maybe. September 1st is probably more realistic. So I think if push came to shove, we could shave off a month, possibly 2, if we wanted to pursue ending our contract with public charters, essentially for cause earlier. So I guess I would entertain any thoughts on that as to what the board would be looking at as it relates to that topic.
Barry, are you expecting any pushback from public charters if the board goes in that direction? And if so, what kind of costs would we incur?
That is hard for me to say. I had a conversation last week, really hoping that they were basically going to say, wow, we really like to get out of this early, any possibility of us doing that, and really kind of pushing on to their decision. Instead, I got, wow, we're really going to follow through and end the contract on the best terms we can. So their intention, based on that conversation, is they fully intend to do the best they can through the end of September. If we went down the path of basically saying, well, we don't want that, I don't know what their reaction would be. I don't think it would be costly, but there's so much, with the economy and everything downturning. Everyone's looking for opportunities to offset costs. So that might give them impetus to pursue things that they wouldn't normally, just because we're instigating a divorce instead of them.
Well, Barry, I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen first, though. I mean, Cape Air is saying they're going to work on that transition, but they're not going to commit resources until DOT awards. They still have to put together their plans for the future. It sounds to me like it's going to take Cape Air a while to really, maybe 6 months, 3 months before it'll be operating. What would you guess?
Well, again, I mean, October 1st, which is months from now, is, no problem for anybody. That is what the process is aligned to do.
Okay.
Through push, we can bring that in easily 30 days. More difficultly, we could bring it in 90 or 60 days. But 60 days, we're now talking 2.5 months for a lot of things to happen, which is going to be challenging.
Yeah, that'd be pretty tough.
And the biggest thing that's going to have to happen is DOT's decision.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's kind of if DOT is only going to go faster than their typical, if we push them and say, we have essentially an emergency situation where we need you to move as fast as possible. They're not going to do that unless asked. So unless we begin pushing for something faster now, it is going to be October 1st.
Well,
And
the only reason I can see for maybe pushing was if Jim doesn't get his Beechcraft functional like he's talking about and cuts back on our number of flights that we're supposed to be scheduled for in the summertime. That would be a trigger point in my mind.
I can understand that. That makes sense.
Right. So I guess the best thing for us to do right at the moment here, from what I'm hearing, is just kind of stay posted with DOT and see where they go. Stay on top of them and think about as to whether we want to pull the trigger earlier with Jim Gallagher and his group.
Okay. If that is the consensus, that is the marching orders I will follow.
Any other comments? I didn't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but kind of looks to me like that would be the way I would go.
Well, I think we're interested in getting going with Cape Air as soon as possible, but we don't want to create any problems either. So.
Okay. So Barry, that's the direction to follow at the moment.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow. Finally to my last slide.
Okay, go ahead.
We're working with public charters on a safe travel message. Essentially what we're trying to do is to document along the lines of what the industry is doing, what cleaning procedures there are, how we are applying social distancing into a tin can that crams people together. But right now, the plans they have are to limit sales on the 30-seater to 20 seats. So that there would be no two people would be sitting next to each other unless they were part of a household unit where they, chose to sit together. But everyone would have at least one seat separating them in any given row. You may have someone directly in front of you or directly behind you in a different row. But again, that's, so that's kind of what they're thinking is in the Beach 1900, the same thing, although because of its layout of seats, you only really lose one seat by making that. So these are things that we're working through, and then how to put that messaging together so that it is consistent from a marketing standpoint, so people know when they have concerns, these are the policies, procedures, and this is what to expect.
Barry, for public charters in Cape Air, let's say they're following pretty much the requirements, separation of seats, et cetera. Let's say somebody does come down with coronavirus and dies. Can they have a lawsuit on it? Are they protected, or how does that work?
That is a big topic, not only across aviation, but across everything right now. And it is something that Congress at the federal level is working to address, is that liability question. Because it's certainly preventing, or a lot of businesses are considering not reopening because of that very question, is what liability would I have if I'm a restaurant, for example, if someone were to contract the virus in my establishment because we've reopened. The federal government is looking at providing kind of comprehensive liability immunity for the situation, but that has not yet happened. I don't know if that was included in what the House passed on Friday or not. And Karen, do you happen to know anything on this topic? You might be involved a little bit more on this.
There's nothing specific right now. Like you said, they're discussing it, but a lot of organizations, I mean, you go through your insurance providers, your, to kind of cover every base you can. But there are currently several lawsuits out there that people have gotten sick at work, or they say they got sick at work. So they're suing their employers.
I thought there'd be a lot of litigation, so apparently there is.
And I think we're at the beginning of that curve, just because it takes time to sort through all that. So
That's an interesting point.
it isn't specific to aviation, but it does apply. It's not something I think any of our providers are going to use as reasons not to operate, unless this, unless it goes the wrong way and there is liability for everybody, in which case that could, quickly change things. But as of now, it's on everyone's plate to be aware of it.
The biggest thing, Barry, that I see is that people have to prove negligence on the part of, the company or the airline or whatever it is. So that's really what they're going, is like, if you don't have some sort of procedures or anything sitting there, not whether or not they're how good they are, but you have to have the basics. That's what people are focusing on. It's they're suing for negligence.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. My last item is I'm going to be starting work this week with Right Side Design on our website redesign, taking into account Cape Air's transition now that we know who that is likely to be. So that will be moving forward. That is my reports. If there are any...
Is Cape Air going to work with you on the redesign then, I take it? Sure.
Their regional marketing person has already reached out to me. I've actually had one call in the past with her. So yes, they will be working with us.
Great.
Barry, I haven't talked to Brandon in a while, and from our discussions last week when we were trying to choose a carrier, is Brandon on board with Cape Air? I got the impression that he is.
Yes.
Am I feeling the right thing?
He and I worked through kind of the spreadsheet together, so I had someone to bounce ideas off of. So yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Any old business, unfinished business anybody's aware of that would like to bring up at this time? Okay, with no comment, I assume that's none. So moving on to new business. Wait a minute, Barry, you didn't, okay, your old business was the extra thing,
Well,
the extra money.
We got 2021 budget, it looks like, next.
so,
I know, but did you want to cover this as old business, Barry, before we moved on to the new
no,
business?
I said to add it as new business.
Okay, okay.
So as it relates to the budget, Susan and I have gone through and kind of gotten a draft together. I would recommend that the next steps be taken is that the budget committee meet. We've already talked about that before our next meeting, and that the board discuss at their next meeting the draft budget.
Okay, again, on the budget committee, in the next week or so, we're gonna have to set a time for that. And on the budget committee, Andrew, your chair, I'm on the committee, and Mark, you're on the committee.
Okay.
So we'll have to set a time for that in the next week or so, because I'd like to have that, the budget meeting after we have the capital meeting, so we can bring the projects we have on the capital side into the budget meeting, and then review what Barry's got, so we can put it all together to bring it to our next regular meeting. Does that sound okay with everybody?
Yeah, we'll do it via audios and
We can do it
The video?
that way, or we can do it back over here in the airport boardroom right here, because the conference room, because it's big enough for 3 of us to sit in here, or 4 of us, if Barry wants to join us, and still have the correct spacing.
Hmm.
And in my preference, I'd rather have the boardroom here. Then we can all watch each other closer.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Barry, you want to bring up the extra item?
Yeah, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. It's fairly straightforward. We're basically modifying the contract with Reith Riley for the runway resurfacing and adding, thought I had it printed out. I don't see it right in front of me right now. But adding into it the amount for some additional signage that came up during our inspection in December. The FAA is basically now saying that any piece of pavement that connects to runways must have signs on it to notify people that you're about to enter a runway and there needs to be a stop sign and et cetera. This is something that they've been looking at over time, and a couple years ago, they required that we paint stop lines on these pieces of pavement as kind of a visual cue, but now they're tightening that requirement and actually requiring signage. So these aren't cheap signs.
Are the feds providing funds for that, or the kind of state?
Yes, so it would be at our 2.5% local match.
Oh.
So, so that's kind of why it's getting rolled into this project, as opposed to we just fully fund it 100% locally by rolling it into this project. It gets done in a timely fashion and gets mostly paid for through federal dollars.
I think we can blame Harrison Ford for this.
Oh, yeah. I think you got a point there, Barry. I understand where you're coming from. But yeah, it's cheaper for the 2.5% on us versus 100% down the road. Correct, Barry?
Yep.
That's what you're saying.
And right now, our agreement with the FAA is that this task needs to be addressed by middle of June. That kind of gives us the window that they're expecting compliance with this.
Well, I'm recommending we go forward with this extra expenditure to get this signage as required and as required by MDOT. So Barry, what would you like approval to go ahead and sign off on this?
Yep.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to allow Barry to go ahead and,
I move we accept the contract addendum as presented by Barry.
I'll
And
support that.
I would request that you authorize someone to sign on behalf of the board as part of your motion.
How about our chair?
that'll be fine. Put that into the motion.
As approved and signed by the chair.
Do I have a second to all that?
Second.
Okay. Julie, can we have a roll call on that? Before we do that, Barry, will that take care of what you wanted?
Yep.
Okay.
That's
Julie, go ahead, if you would. please.
Julie, you're still on mute.
Hi, Mr.
Okay.
Hawes,
Yes,
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes,
Okay, and Mr. Dance and Ms. Goodman have both left the meeting.
okay, I saw Karen left, but I didn't see Mr. Dunce leaving.
Jeff sent a audio, I guess.
Okay, so we're good to go on that. I guess we covered new business. We're all set on that. Before we adjourn, any comments by authority members as we go around the table here? Have we covered most everything today? I believe we have. And I'm going to say meeting adjourned then.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again for
Thank you.
posting in.